Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of Master the NEC, where we talk about the National Electrical Code and all things electrically related. My name is Paul Abernathy, and I'm the host for this podcast. Thanks for joining me today. Today's show is actually sponsored by myceudepot.com. That's myceudepot.com. Your one-stop source for all of your continuing education's license renewal, online training. It automatically gets submitted to your state, and you take the classes, and you get your continuing education credits all taken care of. If you're an engineer, you can also get your PDUs classes taken care of as well for a broad range of topics, even for the building code, residential code, whatever you need. All there. Just simply go to www.myceudepot.com, or you can go to our website, masterthenec.com, and you can get there as well. All right, so today's episode, we're going to talk services. We're going to talk everything that has to do with Article 230 when it comes to 230.2, that is the number of services, and we're going to talk about how it relates to 230.40 and the various exceptions when dealing with service entrance conductors. Now, that's all we're going to top, so I guess I shouldn't say we're going to cover all of 230. We're going to cover those two things in today's episode because we do get a lot of questions, a lot of emails, a lot of topics that come up when it deals with the number of services that can be bought to a building. And then how exactly does the 230.40 and the various exceptions play into the rule when it comes to those service entrance conductors and whatnot. And it's important to understand they are significantly different. And while they are intertwined with references that send you back and forth, the reality is one's dealing with services and one's dealing with a condition where we can extend those service entrance conductors maybe to on around the building to other locations in a building and things like that. So we'll kind of look at all those examples, if you will. I'll try to describe them to you the best I possibly can over a podcast. And we'll kind of clear up some misconceptions and things like that. Well, first things first, we always want to look at the scope of the article that we're dealing with. And of course, 230.1 is the scope. The .1 tends to be the section within all the articles that talk about the actual scope of what that article is all about. And that should always be your first stop when you're looking at something, is just to make sure that what you're asking yourself to do is located within the actual scope of the article that you're getting ready to dabble in. And so, of course, we're dealing with services, so we need to understand what the scope is of services. It says this article covers service conductors and equipment for control and protection of services and their installation requirements. So if it has something to do with services, service conductors, things like that, you obviously know we're going to be somewhere in Article 230 for those applications. Okay. The other thing that I usually would draw people's attention to first, and I do this with students a lot when they're preparing for an exam, is you'll notice that there's a figure on the right that actually shows you the actual layout from the servicing utility all the way down to the service equipment, overcurrent protection, and of course even gives you references for the branch, circuit, and feeder applications. Most certainly, if you're trying to size conductors and things like that, you want to be in Article 210 or 225, depending on what you're dealing with, okay? Or 215 if it's just feeder. 225 being outside feeder and branch circuit. So you kind of got to understand the lay of the land here. But when I'm telling somebody to take an exam, there's 8 parts here. So what I try to get people to do is up near the top when you see general, and you'll see overhead service conductors, and you'll see part 3, which is underground service conductors, and it kind of goes all the way down to part 8. To the right of that, I encourage people to write down the actual page number that each one of these parts start on, because it can save you a lot of time in an exam. So you ask yourself, what kind of tip really is that? And let me tell you, when you're taking an exam, it's all about time management. So here, it allows you to get to point A to point B as quickly as possible. And that's what we're trying to do. And whatever time I can shave off of a question and I can give myself back in the exam is going to help me when I get to those calculations that might take just, a little more time. So in this example here, you're dealing with part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, all the way down to part 8. You might want to go and jot down what page each one of those parts start on. Okay? And Also, there's also room in here for service entrance conductors if you want to jot down a certain section and apply to something. Most of the exams that you take will allow you to write with a permanent pen in your code book, and then of course highlight it so it looks permanent. But you need to check with your testing location. You need to check with your PSI if that's who's doing your testing. And make sure they're okay with you writing in the book. So don't just take what I say as gospel. It's your due diligence to make sure that you can do that. Most of the states that I work with, they allow you to mark it in there. You can't tape things in there. You can't tape little charts in there, but they will allow you to write things in there. And then, of course, I just, as a precaution, I like to highlight what I write. That way it makes it very clear to whoever that it's permanent, and I didn't do it while we're in the test-taking phase because I'm not allowed to have a highlighter or anything like that while I'm taking a test. So that's just what I do, and that's how I teach my students, that type of thing, provided you're allowed to mark in your book. All right, but anyway, you could do that. It's a good little shortcut. Gives you a quick, shave some time off that you might have during an exam. So that's just a little tip for you. All right, so let's get into part one. Really, we're going to focus on 230.2, the number of services. So there's a general rule here. I like to say it's up in the charging statement. When we say charging statement, that is your overall statement, and that lets you know the tone of where it's going, and then it gives you some guidance to what else might be in that section. Most notably in this one, dot 2. So let's read it and get a better understanding of what we're dealing with. It says 230.2, number of services. It says a building or other structure served shall be supplied by only one service, unless permitted in 230.2a through d. So obviously we're going to have a subsections A, B, C, and D that's going to give us some caveats and say, well, we'll let you have more than one services if you meet any of these type of rules. Okay. Again, more than one service to the structure. All right. Or to the building, I should say. All right. I guess it could be a structure too. All right. So then it goes on to say, for the purpose of 230.40 exception number 2, only underground sets of conductors that are 1/0 or 1/0, referred to as 1/0, or some people 1/0. AWG stands for American Wire Gauge, the old Brown and Sharp method. Now we refer to it as American Wire Gauge. And larger, running to the same location and connected together at their supply end, but not connected together at their load end, shall be considered to be supplying one service. So that's if I have a pad-mounted transformer and I'm going to run underground service entrance conductors over to 6 separate disconnects. And of course, you have to kind of understand the disconnect rule in 230.71 and the concept of grouping in 230.72, which we do in another podcast. So I encourage you to listen to those podcasts if you don't know anything about those sections in the code. All this is saying is we're going to let you do that. Of course, this is kind of like paralleling because they got that 1/0 requirement, which is kind of like what we get in 310.10h of the NEC when it comes to paralleling. However, it's not truly paralleling because we're only connecting one end. But you see some of the same rules kind of come in there. This also only applies to underground sets of conductors in this rule. And again, it's 230.40 exception number 2. So those are service entrance conductors. It just happens to be those of the underground set type. Okay. And that's a very common application where you have a transformer located pad, and I got a 6 disconnects made for a 6-unit building, and I'm going to come over, and each one's going to have their own disconnect, but still one service. So it comes together on one end at the transformer, but then it separates to each separate service disconnect over at the building, grouped in one location in accordance with 230.71 and 72, meeting all those rules and whatnot. Okay, so there are conditions where we can have more than one service, and that is conditions A through D. So we need to look at each one of these and kind of just go over them and what they bring to the table. So under condition A, it says special conditions. It says an additional service may be permitted to supply the following. So you have 6 items here. Fire pumps, emergency systems, legally required standby systems, optional standby systems, parallel power production systems, and of course, system designed for connection to multiple sources of supply for the purpose of enhanced reliability. We see that a lot in COP systems. We see that a lot in governmental entities that need to have multiple systems coming in from different taps in the utility system in order to have the reliability. So there's other means here that allows you to have additional services to a building other than the one service that's permitted to a building. Okay, so if you meet any of these special conditions, then I will let you take an additional service to a building. The one that I usually like to highlight, although it can apply generally to all of them, one that I like to apply is a fire pump. There are applications in the code where I have one service to a building, and I can tap on the supply side of the service disconnect in order to supply a fire pump, and I got an assortment of rules I have to meet in 695. That's Article 695. But at the end of the day, I could bring an additional service to this building for the specific application of this fire pump. Perfectly acceptable. And this is one of the conditions where I could do that. Of course, in many applications, I also have generators that supply fire pumps, and that's not a service, that's a feeder. But there are allowances for that as well. So here we're simply talking about the ability to bring additional services to a building. So that is kind of a condition we like to say, condition A in 230.2a. We move on to B, which is special occupancies. So we have some applications that says by special permission, and generally special permission means by who? That means by the AHJ. So they're giving some kind of special permission, and this is typically done in writing, that says, look, I understand that there's a condition where you're going to need an additional service, and I'm okay with that. I'm going to give you this quote-unquote special permission to do this, and there's two conditions here, or two items under the subsection B. And that is item number 1, and that is multiple occupancy buildings where there's no available space for service equipment accessible to all occupants. In other words, I can't put everything in one location. It's just impossible for me to do that. So, I'm going to allow you to have, say, 2 service drops or 2 sets of overhead service conductors supplying 2 services installed at separate locations for this single building, where it's just no available space for the service equipment to be accessible to all occupants. So I have to move it out. I have to be able to have the additional service drops to this building. And of course, if that's the case, where, then that's one of the applications that I'm going to allow you to meet the allowance here under 230.2b1. Okay? So that is a rule that allows me to do that. The second one is a single building or structure sufficiently large to make 2 or more services necessary. All right, so when we're dealing with that application, it could simply be a service that's just really, really large. Typically, in this application, you need to have multiple services in order to be able to facilitate this installation. Okay. So we're going to give you some allowances here, services for certain occupancies under the special permission. Maybe it's just simply impractical or even impossible for one service for an industrial plant with sufficient capacity to be done by one service. Okay, so through the AHJ special permission, we're going to allow you to have an additional service, okay? And that's one of those allowances to do that. All right? And of course, that differs a little bit from the allowance we're going to hear about in a second when it deals with capacity requirements under subsection C, which is another way that I can get multiple services to a building. The key difference here is that under the special occupancy, I have to obtain a special permission, whereas in C, which is a capacity requirement, it's pretty evident, and I don't need special permission. Okay, so the one that's a single building or structure sufficiently large to make 2 or more services necessary, it really doesn't have an amperage threshold. It is really something that this by special permission means that the AHJ is involved in some way. And due to the size of the building, it's a single building or a single structure, and it's just so large in size that they have made the determination that 2 or more services are necessary. And at that case, then you're getting your special permission to be able to do that. And so that's how that rule would apply. All right, now looking at items subsection C, which is capacity requirements. Additional services shall be permitted under any of the following. The first one says where the capacity requirements are in excess of 2,000 amperes at the supply voltage of 1,000 volts or less. Okay, so 480 systems, 240 systems, I'm going to tell you right now, most of those that are going to be larger, over 2,000 amperes, obviously could be 480, but are probably going to be a 480 type system. But you just need to understand that this one, it's less about the voltage and everything about the actual ampacity. So if I have it sufficient due to my calculations in Article 220, under Part 3 or Part 4, whether you're dealing with standard or optional, and it comes out the fact that I need to have a capacity of 2,000 amperes, or excess of 2,000, I should say. If that's the case and it gets over 2,000, then what I'm going to need is a potential additional service to meet the capacity need, the capacity need. And so really don't need special permission here. This just is what it is. So if you do that calculation that's necessary, then you'll get permission to have an additional service to a building. Okay? So that's what that one is. And of course you have a number 2, or item 2, under 230.2C2. And it says where the load requirements for a single phase installation are greater than the serving agency's normal supply through one service. So if you have a building and it's single phase, but the capacity that you need can't be supplied by single phase, then it's still not going to be 3-phase. You're still dealing with a single phase application. Then it might require that additional service be brought to that building. For example, maybe your utilities stop at a 400 amp single phase service for this building, but your capacity that's necessary might be 800. Well, if 400 is all they can bring, then that would allow them to actually bring you another 400, and thus bringing 2 services to this building in order to meet this capacity requirement. And so that's what we're talking about in 230.2C2. So again, no special permission needed. It is what it is. It's all based on the calculation. The engineers do this. And then, of course, your building officials will work with you because, again, this is a capacity issue. Okay? And, of course, item number 3 is a direct special permission rule. Means that it really doesn't matter about 1 and 2. You didn't need special permission to meet what's in item B or subsection B of 230.2b. This is saying, look, if it's a capacity issue, then they have the ability to give you special permission. Maybe it's not over 2,000. Maybe it is 2,000 amperes, but it's not excess of 2,000. So C1 doesn't apply, but the jurisdiction looks at it and goes, God, but it's physically, your capacity doesn't make it practical in order to get you a 2,000 amp service, by simply one supply to the building. So by special permission, we're going to allow you to have multiples. Okay, so you can get a special permission. It is a loan by itself, exactly as it sounds. Special permission. You get that in writing from the AHJ. Doesn't always mean the electrical inspector, so I'm going to be honest with you. If I was getting special permission under this rule, under 230.2C3, I would probably want to get something directly from the building official in writing to be able to do that. But, that's the direction you need to go with that. Okay, get that special permission in writing. Okay, and then we get to D, which is the last of the options here to allow you to bring another service to a building, and that's called different characteristics. It says additional services may be permitted for different voltages, frequencies, and phases, or for different uses, such as for different rate schedules. Because if I have the same voltages, but I have different rate schedules, if I can convince the jurisdiction that this is the case, based on maybe it's peak or off-peak or whatever type of different rate schedules, then they might allow me to bring multiple services to a building. The most notable one that this takes place with is phases. For example, I could have a 12208 and I could bring a service there, and I'm limited to one service. But then if I want to bring a 277-480 or drop a 480 system down, then that's a different phase. It's a different characteristic that I could bring down and do that. And that would be different voltages, okay, as well. So I've got two things going on. I had different phases. That could be single phase versus three phase. But also, like I just said, I could have the voltages. Hopefully I didn't get those two back, cross-linked to each other. But incidentally, they kind of work together. So that's a different voltages. 122.40 versus 277.480 brought to the building. Okay, so you could have that aspect of it. Okay, so if I've got different characteristics than what's already being supplied to the building, then I can do that as well. That is very common for buildings that have a lighting system and they want to bring a separate that might handle motors, if they're 480 motors and things like that brought to the building, rather than have a bunch of transformers in the building that have to step up a 122.08 in order to try to achieve something. It really depends on your building layout, or a building that might have 480 to handle all of its large type of loads and they don't want to step it down to a 122.08, so they bring in a separate, if it's available, a separate service, and that simply handles those loads, maybe for administrative, lighting, things like that, whatever. Okay, so you do have the ability to add different characteristics to this aspect. Now, the last one we're going to cover in this one is E. That's identification. Okay, because as you saw in the general rule here, or the charging statement in 230.2, we're simply talking about the number of services of the building. Now, once we establish that, then the identification component kicks in, and that's the item E. Okay, or I should say subsection E. I kind of mess that up all the time. And it deals with identification. It says where a building or structure is supplied by more than one service, which we are permitted under the conditions under A through D. Okay, it's going to say or any condition or any combination of branch circuits, feeders, or services as a permanent plaque or directory shall be installed at each service disconnection location, denoting all the services, feeders, or branch circuits supplying that building or structure and the areas serving each. And it reminds us to look at 225.37, which is obviously dealing with outside feeder and branch circuits as well. So it's really key component to remember that when I do bring additional services to a building, and I'm permitted to do so in 230.2 A through D under those specific types of conditions, that I have to put some kind of identifications here. Phenolic labels, whatnot. I will also state that it would be nice if it did state in here that they had to also be designed so they can handle the effects of where they're located, their condition of use, whether it's outside or whatnot. And we do cover that later in other areas of the code. But it would be nice to have something written in here that actually states that. But anyway, you get the point. It's got to be able to withstand the location, otherwise it's pointless. Deterioration due to UV or wet locations or whatever it is. Okay, so that's your identification. So provided that you can have the additional services, then you've got E that's telling you, okay, you've got more than one. Now we need to do some identification. Okay, that's what that's dealing with. So that's a quick understanding of what the number of services to a building and what you can have additional ones, and that should be pretty clear on how that rule applies. Now, we're going to shift gears to the allowances in the application for, hold on, let me do that. I got to get my code book here so I can jump in it. In part 4, where we're dealing with service entrance conductors. And now, most notably, we're going to talk about 230.40 number of service entrance conductor sets. Now, it says each service drop, set of overhead service conductors, set of underground service conductors, or service laterals shall supply only one set of service entrance conductors. Basic rule that kind of follows the mold and concept of 230.2. Okay, one set. Now, with that said, this is where you get into the exceptions. And the exceptions are going to be able to say, okay, well, I could come to the building with one service drop, let's say, or one service lateral, or the allowances that we just saw in exception number 2 at 230.40, whereas it's their underground service conductors where they're connected at one end back at the transformer, but they're not connected at the other end. We're going to allow that. So we already kind of understand that one, so maybe we won't talk about exception number 2 that much. But the general rule is each service drop, set of overhead conductors, set of underground service conductors, and all that really can only have one set and that's it. Of course, when you get to that location, of course, then you have you could have a wireway or what have you, and then of course it branches out, and that's where your 6 disconnects come in, and whatever you want to do. All right, and hopefully you understand the concept of 230.71 for the number that gets you to the 2 to 6 rule, and of course, hopefully you understand 230.72 grouping, because it's important that you understand the grouping concept. Okay, especially when you're dealing with this one, because you can get a little confused. So I encourage you to go back and listen to that podcast about the grouping if I've lost you at any point. Hopefully I have not. Okay. Only one set. All right, now let's look at some exceptions. Now the most widely used exception here, in my opinion, is exception number 1. And I'll paint you a visualized image audibly, or whatever. I'm going to give you a concept so you get it. All right, exception number 1 says, okay, we know the general rule in 230.40. However, it says a building with more than one occupancy, okay, more than one occupancy, shall be permitted to have one set of service entrance conductors for each service as defined in 230.2, run to each occupancy or group of occupancies if the number of service disconnection locations for any given classification of service does not exceed 6. So when I run from that service out to those service disconnection means, let's say in an apartment complex where I want to run a separate unit on the outside of the building to, actually I told you I'd use the strip mall example because that's the one we want to use. Okay, I'm backing up here. I don't want to get you confused. If I have a 6-unit strip mall application with 6 separate occupancies in it, then I could gain one service drop to this building. However, because that's what the general rule says, but then I can also go from that point of attachment and that service point and then have service entrance conductors continue on to those each individual units on the outside exterior, because that would still be service entrance conductors. They haven't run through an overcurrent device yet to become feeders. Then I can carry on to each one of those different occupancies, okay? And then I would hit the service disconnection means that's located at each one of these occupancies. And of course, I got to meet the rules of 230.70A1, outside our nearest point of entry, hit the service disconnection mean. But I think you get it. That means I don't have to meet a grouping aspect of it. I have to have the grouping component take place wherever that service disconnect is. But here, I'm not at disconnects yet. I'm really just tapping, if you will, the service conductors and continuing them on to the actual extra occupancies that we're talking about here. So that's allowance in exception number 1. Okay, run to each occupancy. Okay, now it says, I'll continue on. It says if the number of service disconnection locations of any given classification of service drops not exceeding 6, the requirements of 230.2E shall apply at each location. Okay. So that means the requirements for that labeling, the location, the identification that we talked about has to apply to each location. Okay? And then it also lets us know if the number of service disconnection locations exceeds 6 for any given supply classification, all service disconnection locations for all supply characteristics together with any branch circuit or feeder supply sources, if applicable, shall be clearly described using suitable graphics or text, or both, or on one or more plaques located in an approved, readily accessible location on the building or structure served, and as near as practical to the points of attachment or entries for each service drop or service lateral, and for such sets of overhead and underground service conductors. Okay, let me translate that for you because that is a lot of words. All right. So basically what we're trying to say is if you have the number of service equipment locations for any classification of service actually does exceed 6, then a master plaque or some kind of directory is actually required near the point where the service conductors actually attach or enter the building or structure. So that point where it makes the connection to the building. Of course, then they branch off to wherever they're going. And if it's obviously more than 6 out there, let's say it's a 12-unit building and it branches off to hit all 12s, obviously that exceeds 6. So I have to have some kind of graphic or some specified text that explains this, or maybe even a combination of both. And then, of course, at the individual service equipment locations, each of those are required for marking requirements must also be provided. Okay, and that's pretty much covered in 230.70b, if you will. All right. Okay. So if you only have 6 locations, then you still have to meet the identification requirements when it comes to 230.2e. It's only when you exceed 6, and of course you're allowed to do that. Once you exceed the 6, like my example of 12 units, then you just really have to get into some kind of text or some kind of graphical depiction or a combination of both at the point where it connects to the building. Or if it enters the building, at the point where it does that. Again, be careful. It's generally not going to enter the building because these are still service conductors. Okay, so but at that location where it comes to the building, it typically comes down the building. A lot of times to a that's also where you have your meter location, and then it'll continue on. One of the things to actually remember is that when it happens, again, you're going to have to do a little more types of labeling, a graphic depiction, but then you're still going to have your marking requirements at all these other locations, and you got to meet all the marking rules that we talked about as well, dealing with the 230.70b, which provides for that general marking requirement. Okay? All right. So that's what we're doing with that. So let's kind of go back to the code now again and go a little further. Okay, so that's what you're dealing with exception number 1, and that one is pretty darn common. Okay, we use that a lot on multiple buildings. Okay, merchant buildings, they might have 8 units or so, or 7 units, and it's supplied by a 208/120 service. Of course, at that point you have maybe 8 sets of service interconductors that can be installed with one set run to each different occupancy. Okay, and it comes down from the building, and of course each one of those services in each occupancy can also have up to 6 disconnects under the rules of 230.70a, so that's not an issue there. Of course, you're going to have, because it exceeds 6, you're going to have a permanent plaque identifying the multiple supply equipment and where they're located. Of course, and then of course you're going to have the HJ is going to want to know where that's going to be, so that's generally going to be the most specific area that they're going to reference you to place it. So I would encourage you to ask them. Okay, but since it is more than 6, and then of course you also have your marking that's generally required at all of your service disconnection means out there as well. Okay, so you got to meet all the requirements of 230.70b. You got the grouping requirements. 230.72 for those individual services that are out there that are extended based on the allowances of 230.40 exception number 1. Hey man, being an electrician is a difficult thing. There's a lot of things that you have to be aware of. Just don't get confused in the fact that when you're talking about services, you're talking about services. Now we're not talking about the number of services to a building. We're talking about the extension of the service entrance conductor to different occupancies of the actual building. Okay? All right. Don't want you to get lost in that. And I know you're not. You've listened to our podcast before, so you got it clear. And of course, exception number 2 is what we kind of just talked about a little while ago. But I'll read it just to read it. I won't discuss it any more than what we've already gone, unless after reading it I feel like clarity needs to be done. Then we'll do that. I would like to say that probably the majority of them that people use is exception number 1, with exception to exception number 3, which is a one-family dwelling when you have an accessory building or a detached garage or something like that. But we'll cover that when we get there. All right, exception number 2 says where 2 to 6 service disconnection means in separate enclosures are grouped in one location. And we kind of talked about that, where you had the transformer, it's connected on one end, and then of course it separates into 6 disconnects, maybe grouped in one location at the building. It says, and where the supply separate loads from one service drop or set of overhead service conductors, set of underground service conductors or service laterals, one set of service entrance conductors shall be permitted to supply each or several such service equipment enclosures. Okay, so the note that we were given in 230.2 is just making it clear about those that are coming from underneath the transformer, underground aspects of it, But I think that you see exception number 2 here is a pretty daggone broad application, because that very much can happen in an installation, and we want to sometimes give people an understanding where you might need to use this rule. And so I encourage it to be utilized in an application where, maybe I have an application where I've got one building and I got more than one occupancy with separate loads supplied by 4 sets of underground service conductors. That would be a prime example of the use of 230.40 exception number 1. However, if I had the allowance for, like I said, the transformer application, which is the easiest one to do, then it talks about the application where, look, I can go from one location and I could have one building with more than one occupancy with separate loads fed by one service lateral or one set of underground service conductors per 230.2. Then that's when 230.40 exception number 2 allows me to take over from the service point, which is typically in the utility transformer, and individually go out and hit 6 separately located, all grouped in one location, service disconnection means, and we would still consider that one service. Okay? All right, that's an allowance there, but there is a broader use for the exception number 2, okay? And you need to understand it, because this rule doesn't specifically just apply to the underground application, okay? Because it clearly talks about supply separate loads from one service drop, okay? One set of overhead service conductors and what have you. Okay, exception number 3, a one-family dwelling unit and its accessory structures shall be permitted to have one set of service entrance conductors run from each from a single service drop set of overhead service conductors or a set of underground service conductors or service laterals. What does this mean? Well, I have an accessory building. I can bring it to this, say, one-family dwelling, and then, of course, I can continue on with those service conductors that are still outside of the building and continue over to my actual accessory structure, which could be a garage, could be a mother-in-law suite type of little building or whatnot. It's still service conductors. It still has an allowance for you to be able to do this. It's still one service to a building, and the first building might be supplied by an overhead, but it might pass through, and also, depending on how your meter taps work, dual taps or dual lugs, then it continues on and over to the accessory building. And that is allowed for you to do that under exception number 3. Very common to take place in those one-family dwellings where it has an accessory building like a detached garage, and you don't want to bring a separate service to the detached garage, which you probably could, but you don't want to do that. And so you have this application that you can do that. The only other time that I would probably bring a separate service to a detached building like that is if for some reason I wanted to have it metered separately. And then you just need to clarify with your local utility whether they will allow that, or whether in some cases it's not close enough to the utility connection point that you would have to spend quite a bit of money to make that connection, so it's much easier to simply put it in from the one that drops to the house, and then you can take care of it from there. And then, of course, you'd have to hire an electrician to do that. And there's still service entrance conductors, but in this case, they're probably now going to be on the load side of the service point, and that's when the depth requirements and all this goodies come into play. And that's where the NEC picks up. NEC really doesn't apply to the depth of cover, for example, for something like a service lateral. Everybody thinks it does, but it doesn't. Once it leaves from the service point and it goes from utility to the premise wiring aspect of it, then that's where the NEC is going to kick in. Okay. The next one we would look at is exception number 4. It says two-family dwellings, multifamily dwellings, and multiple occupancy buildings shall be permitted to have one set of service entrance conductors installed to supply the circuits covered in 210.25. Okay. Now, at this point, I'm assuming everybody out there in the code world knows what 210.25 is. This is for those common areas. And so I could have multifamily building like it's talking about, and I might have common areas that I can't supply those common areas from any dwelling unit. And of course, that's what 210.25 says in subsection A, which says dwelling unit branch circuits. It says branch circuits in each dwelling unit shall supply only loads within that dwelling unit or loads associated only with that dwelling unit. And of course, the B, subsection B of 210.25 reminds us that common area branch circuits, the branch circuits supplying for the purpose of lighting, central alarm, signaling, communication, other purposes for the public or common area, has to be supplied by separate equipment that is not supplied by individual dwelling units or things like that, or tenant spaces. So it's just reminding you that, hey, the allowance here under this code rule is saying, look, we're going to let you be able to extend and be able to run service entrance conductors over to what's called a common panel, okay? And that's going to handle all the common loads. Indirectly, it kind of could also maybe fall under exception number 1, but it is specifically permitted under the allowance here for exception number 4 for 2-family dwellings, multifamily dwellings, and multiple occupancy buildings where I might have a need for applications that typically wouldn't allow me to serve them through 210.25, and we just kind of talked about what that was. Common area lighting, other loads that might be common that can't be fed by the dwelling unit that might be used by the public or a common area. That kind of rule. So it's a good rule because we have a lot of common areas in 2-family dwellings, maybe the lighting out front. There's rules that you could probably get away as long as each entrance has lighting and it's switched by that individual dwelling unit or that individual unit. But then that's a lot of times that's not possible in multifamily dwellings or even in multiple occupancies where you have to have some kind of lighting outside that might deal with photometrics, the lighting requirements for egress and things like that, which typically can't be on any of the units panels. So good rule. Kind of tries to speak to the same language of exception number 1, but it's got its own little nuances to it. And the last one is exception number 5. It says one set of service conductors connected to the supply side of a normal service disconnection means shall be permitted to supply each or several systems covered by 230.82.5 or 230.82.6. And of course, if you've heard my other podcast before on this is actually 230.82 deals with what type of equipment can be connected on the supply side of a service disconnect. So item 5 really just deals with all those tap allowances for me to be able to tap this on the supply side. Obviously, that's what we're really doing here when we're dealing with the requirements of 230.40 under these exceptions. We want to be able to make a connection ahead of a service disconnect in order to be able to use those service conductors and run them around to these different occupancies. Well, you'll also have the allowances here to deal with your tapping for, say, fire pump applications or sprinkler systems or standby power or whatnot. Allows you to do this, okay? As well as 6 deals with things like PV or photovoltaic, fuel cell applications, wind electric systems that are going to integrate, or even energy storage systems that are going to be connected on the supply side of the service disconnection means, which the code permits under what we saw previously in the code, most notably when we looked at the allowances for all of these monitoring type of stuff that allows me to have it. So anyway, don't want to digress down a different path here. It allows me to have these connections to this service conductors on the supply side as allowed by 230.82 for item 5 and item 6. Okay, so that's kind of what it's dealing with. All right, so, in a nutshell, we pretty much covered a vast amount of information in a short amount of time. I encourage you to crack your code book open. If you haven't done it in a while, shake the mothballs out of it, get back into your code, and learn that there's a difference between the number of services to a building, and there's a difference in Part 4 of extending service entrance conductors to other occupancies within a building, and all of these exceptions that allow you to do that. Remember, these aren't services that we're extending these to. We're extending these service entrance conductors. You still may only have one service to a building, okay? Or you could have multiple services to a building if you meet the conditions that are pretty clear in 230.2. Okay, all those conditions that would apply. All right. Hopefully you got something out of that. It was a good episode, I think. It's about 45 minutes long. So again, if you have any questions on any of that, please feel free to email me at info, that's INFO, at masterthenec.com, or you can go to our website at masterthenec.com or electricalcodeacademy.com. Just click on the contacts button, and you can actually send us an email directly from the website if you don't want to use your email and send it in that way. Perfectly fine. Visit our website and click on all those social media. We have a lot of social media. We have a lot of videos, a lot of Audible podcasts like this that you can listen to directly from our website. Of course, you can download the Spreaker app and listen to them on the go in your car if you want. Incidentally, you could go to the website in your car and still listen to them all from our website because we have a player that's integrated on the website. And we encourage you to go to our Twitter page. It's at MasterTheNEC. If you're a master electrician, we encourage you to continue your education by joining the CMECP program by going to mycmecp.com and learn more about that program. And all those good things. Help sponsor the show by getting your continuing educations through our partner at myceudepot.com. Or, of course, you can go to our website and get there as well. Hey, that's enough shameless plugs for the day. Thanks for listening. God bless. Until next time, folks. Hey. It's all about learning the code. It's a minimum safety standard. So, hey, I want you to stay safe out there. God bless.